the U.S. government's debt is $31 trillion and growing by someplace on the order of $1 to $2 trillion per year. So there's really nothing they can do about it at this point. Most government spending doesn't come from taxes from individuals and corporations. It comes from selling debt to the Federal Reserve, which then the U.S. government goes out and spends. I'll tell you what's going to happen is that since the U.S. dollar is a floating abstraction, and all of these governments realize that it's losing value by 5 or 10% or something on that order per year. So, they don't like the idea that they have to settle their debts through New York. I mean, you think the Chinese like to pay for things with U.S. dollars? It's using their adversary's currency. What they're going to do is go back to gold. People say, well, maybe we'll use the Chinese yuan. No, nobody trusts the Chinese and their yuan either. So, and look, the Russians and the Chinese, when they trade with each other, until recently, had to use dollars. But they don't want to use dollars, but they don't trust each other's currencies either. And why should they? They're just paper figments of their central bank's imagination. The whole world is going to go back to gold. That's what's going to happen. People are going to trade with gold. Again, it's going to happen. Ideally, there shouldn't be a gold-backed currency. Gold is money, and it should be used as money. And I know this is going to sound outrageous to everybody listening, but the government shouldn't be in the money business, okay? That's not what the government should be doing. I mean, the purpose of the government, which is actually just an instrument of force, is to protect you from force. An army, a police force, and a court system to adjudicate disputes without resorting to force. So they shouldn't be in the money business. They're not trustworthy. The type of people who go to work for the government are innately untrustworthy. So we should just be using gold. But answer to the question is yes. I suspect that the first step on this road is going to be that the Chinese and even the Russians are going to start out with a gold-backed ruble and a gold-backed yuan. It's going to happen. And at that point, if they show themselves to be somewhat trustworthy, people are going to gravitate away from the dollar because the U.S. government is a bankrupt entity at this point. Why should you trust their currency? I mean, it's ridiculous. And we'll go back to gold. There's really nothing else you can use.
And there's nothing
the
U.S. can do to stop it.
No, there's nothing they can do to stop it. People say, well, maybe the world will go to Bitcoin. Well, maybe it will. I mean, there are certain advantages to Bitcoin as money, but I'm putting my money on gold. We're heading into a major crisis. Look, for years, I've said that we're entering upon a phenomenon that I call the Greater Depression, because it's going to be much worse, much longer lasting, and much different than the unpleasantness of 1929 to 1946. And how do I feel about gold? Look, I've been saying for the last several years, it's going up, but it's money, okay? So you ought to treat it as a savings vehicle, not as a speculative vehicle. And I've consistently bought gold for many, many years, and I've never sold a single ounce. So I've been buying it since about $40, and now it's about, $1,900. So I feel better having saved in gold than in dollars, but sometimes it's a good speculation. But right now, it's kind of reasonably priced relative to everything else in the world, relative to a suit of clothes, relative to a meal. You go back historically, gold's kind of reasonably priced. But I still think it's going to go up because I think that we're on the edge of a panic. And when a real panic hits, people like to hold money that is tangible in their own hand, not the promise of some bankrupt government or bankrupt central bank. So that's why I think gold's going higher. Reasonably priced at this point, but it's going higher. There's all kinds of things going on that most people haven't even heard about. For instance, when I was in Zimbabwe, The last time, it was about, how long ago now? 6 years. I spent a lot of time. Well, I've been to Zimbabwe and most African countries a lot over the years, but here's an anecdote that you haven't heard anywhere else. I became very friendly with Gideon Gono. Gideon Gono was the head of the Central Bank of Zimbabwe. And oddly enough, Gideon Gono's signature is on the Zimbabwe $100 trillion note. But he's actually a well-educated, intelligent guy. You think he'd be a blithering idiot having printed up $100 trillion notes. Well, he had to do it to pay the army. But here's the thing that's interesting. Gideon gave me a paper that he wrote promoting that he was trying to sell to Comrade Mugabe, who's dead now, that they ought to have a Zimbabwe gold dollar. Now that's a shocker. Most people don't know that. So there are things going on behind the scenes that we don't hear about on CNN or MSNBC or Fox.
On inflation, Doug.
It's going higher. And the main reason, there are other reasons, but the main reason it's going higher is because the main way that governments all over the world can finance themselves is not by taxes, it's by printing money. So when they print money, that is the cause of inflation. It's not the butcher or the baker or the gasoline maker that causes inflation. They're just reacting to it, the excess of money printed by these central banks. So, inflation is going higher. It's going a lot higher. And the only reason it won't go higher is that maybe we'll have a catastrophic deflation where there's so much debt in the world as a consequence of inflation. A lot of these companies and a lot of individuals are greatly over indebted. The economy slows down. They can't pay the debt. They default on their bonds. And what happens to that $1 billion in bonds that a company might have issued? Well, it just dies and goes to money heaven, and the $1 billion it represents disappears. Same thing when an individual goes bankrupt. We're going to see a lot of that this year and the next. So that could get out of control. You could have a catastrophic deflation, even while the government is still printing up money, trying to maintain the current structure. But I've got to tell you, I really couldn't be more bearish for all kinds of long-term reasons. I mean, the culture itself, the civilization itself, is in the process of slow motion collapse. And the financial markets are all overpriced. I mean, bonds had negative yields. Like I said, I thought that was metaphysically impossible, but I was wrong. But people forget that it was only in the early 80s that the US government was paying up to 18% to borrow money. That's going to happen again.